Okay, hello everyone. I'm Mirsad Krieshtrats, a senior researcher at Bratislava-based Minority Issues Research Institute, known by its acronym MIRI. Our MIRI is dedicated on working towards promoting and protecting human and minority rights in Slovakia and abroad. As part of our activities, we hold monthly conversations with experts and people around the world about important international affairs and issues significantly affecting societies and minorities as our effort to educate and empower general public. To repeat the usual code of conduct for our events, we are going to first hear from our guest scholars, and after that, we will open a discussion for questions and answers. At that point, if you want to ask a question in person, please indicate in the chat and we will call upon you. Once your microphone is on, please introduce yourself and tell us where you are joining us from, and then ask your question. You're also welcome to type in your questions in the chat box if you prefer to ask it like that. Today, we are to discuss the current developments in and around Venezuela. For that, we invited two South American scholars to provide us with South American perspective on the issue. So today we are joined by our previous affiliate and friend, Dr. Luis Santander, and the main presenter, Dr. Fabio Andrés Díaz Pabón. In our conversations today, we are going to focus on the situation in Venezuela after the abduction of Nicolas Maduro, president of Venezuela, from his home by the US military, and the consequent power dilemmas that this development has brought. Our guests will discuss the local political and socioeconomic situation in Venezuela, the new U.S. foreign policy approach, if it is new, to the country and the region, the relationship with neighboring Colombia, and the challenges, prospects, and alternatives all this brings for the governance, international relations, and democracy in South America. As usual, we aim to provide MIRI audiences with more nuanced information about the developments in and around Venezuela from the perspective of the people to whom all this matters the most. We noticed that many people in the Western Hemisphere are discussing Venezuela's situation, but we rarely hear the perspective of the South Americans who are actual subjects in all these deliberations. Given our stated orientation, we at MIRI always try to bring up the perspective of the people who are being focused on political activities and policies and serve as a platform for such voices to contribute towards more comprehensive understandings of the issues at stake. So let me now briefly introduce our guests. Dr. Fabio Andrés Díaz Pabón is transdisciplinary applied researcher. In his observations, Dr. Diaz integrates insights from the multiple disciplines while combating will be good, right? Combining academia and practice on topics of inequality, sustainability, conflict, and development with regional specialization in Latin America and Africa. Currently, Dr. Diaz works as a senior researcher at the Africa Center of Excellence for Inequality Research at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, where he coordinates the University Sustainable Development Goals Fellowship Program. He's also an honorary research associate at the Department of Politics and International Studies at Rhodes University in South Africa. In addition to his academic works, his analysis has been published by numerous journals and online platforms like Al Jazeera, Time, Conversation, the International Peace Institute, Global Observatory, among many. The conversation with Dr. Diaz will be moderated by our very own friend, Dr. Santander, With a PhD in International Development from the University of Birmingham in UK, Dr. Santander has many years of experience as academic practitioner, including working with universities and NGOs in Europe and Colombia. He published works on these topics as well. In Colombia, his focus has been on promoting initiatives dealing with gender and sexual violence in armed conflict, the recovery of political agencies for victims and survivors, reparative justice, and solutions to field dilemmas in informal and non-institutional local practices of transitional justice. And now Dr. Santander will take over, so please go ahead.
Excellent, Mirsad. Thank you very much. Svetlusha and Fabio, thank you for allowing this conversation to take place. And for our audience, whether you're scholars, policymakers, or simply interested in issues in Latin America, we really appreciate you being here. I'm going to give just a 5-minute revision of 4 key points that are important for Fabio and myself, and are the basis for the questions that I will be asking Fabio. So this will be a very brief revision of issues, and I'm trying to share here a quick revision of issues, and then we'll be able to have our conversation. Hopefully you'll be able to see a quick PowerPoint presentation. The first point that I want to make is to point out that there has been a concerning approach of the United States and Venezuela during the months of September to December 2025, and this obviously sparks a range of concerns about the legality of the attacks, the legitimacy of the operations, and voices that mention a U.S. invasion in the region, as well as the old age discussion about the effects of the United States war on drugs in South America. And this will lead to questions that I will ask Dr. Diaz about legality, legitimacy, and the situation and role of international law amidst all of this. The second element that I want to make is, obviously, this has led to an escalation, both in rhetoric and actions, between President Donald Trump and different Latin American administrations, and this is clearly evident. The relationship has been marked by threats, by insults, by condemnations, but also a few ideas about cooperation within the fight against drugs. So this will lead, obviously, to questions about regional politics, about relations within Latin America and between Latin America and the United States, the role of diplomacy, and other actors that will be relevant to this discussion. My third point will be, of course, a new form of economic blockade against Venezuela through oil tanker seizures. And this adds to the rising tensions and prompts a new rhetoric about the intention behind the United States operation of dominating the oil production and distribution process in Venezuela. So this, of course, will lead to questions of what are the plans of the United States and Venezuela? What are the lessons learned from previous interventions that we might want to bear in mind for this discussion? And of course, situations of economic and political fragility. And finally, of course, the attack on January 3rd, it shows a massive display of force. It brings concerns about the damage to life, damage to infrastructure, damage to the environment in Venezuela. And this is obviously marked also by political polarization, characteristic of the regional politics of Latin America, and particularly Venezuela and Colombia. So we will have discussions between the left and the right politics, and this brings a wide range of different attitudes. Some people went to celebrate on the streets. Others condemned the whole scenarios. Others made calls for more U.S. intervention, either in Venezuela and Colombia, but there also have been episodes of resistance, of organization, and contestation of United States imperialism in the region. So, of course, this will lead to questions about division, polarization, what's the space for democracy, what's the space for democratic dialogue here in the region. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing now and move over to Dr. Diaz. Dr. Diaz, thank you so much for being here. In one of your recent online publications, you have focused on an argument that states that Latin America is drifting towards militarized politics as a rehash of the good old Banana Republic playbook. Now, my question to you is, how can the recent events in Venezuela be interpreted through your argument, through this particular topic?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and thank you all for coming today. The second one would be like thinking about your question, Luis. I think, in a way, what is happening in Latin America currently is not new, and the reference to the Banana Republic speaks to the nature of political arrangements locally, international conditions at a global scale, and how they interact. So on the one hand, we have a context in which, after the pandemic, all over the region, there have been an increase in criminality and delinquency, right? And this has led a great societal demand for more security, rightly so. But it has been seen as a vehicle for populist right-wing politicians to mobilize this public discontent to try to bring into the fore their own political agendas. And that means the idea that like you're going to use the army in the streets, that you're going to police societies, without acknowledging the structural reasons that bring higher levels of criminality. And you can see the cases of Venezuela, you can see the cases of Ecuador or any other country in the region. And the reality is that this is not disconnected from the social conditions and the developmental conditions in which people inhabit, right? So if we have a country with like a high income, where people have social protection, jobs, and a purpose in their lives, recruiting them for criminality is extremely difficult, right? But that's not the case in Latin America. And also like undertaking serious political visions of transformation that actually reduce the likelihood of any kind of criminality or crime or conflict takes a lot of work. So it's easier to use like as an excuse the idea of military and militarism to try to correct for all these things like hitting the stick. Of course, security is and will be central to any state and the role of the state, but security should be seen comprehensively as including social protection. Because otherwise, what we're having is the possibility of people arguing that through the military they will fix stuff, and they're starting to sideline the importance of political representation and democracy. Enter international actors and the global landscape, in which talking about human rights or denouncing fascism seems to be more controversial than using the term banana republic. And that creates a lot of problems because we're not addressing the diagnosis correctly. And I think that brings the case of other countries taking advantage of this instability of politicians that are just being clearly opportunistic. I honestly believe that these politicians that are saying we're going to militarize the countries, if what was selling was like radical agendas, change the title, they would change whatever they would want to say. They're just being completely instrumental and cynical about what they're presenting just to get into power. And the idea is about a capture of resources. And in that sense, that creates a political economy in which external powers can benefit from this process because they can like get these benefits from different countries because the international order doesn't really seems to care about democracy more than about mineral resources and benefits them in a way that happened in the 1920s, 1930s when Latin America had the banana republics, where different countries were just involved with Trujillo, the Dominican Republic, and dictators all over the region. And it wasn't really about democracy. It was just about geostrategic positioning and natural resources. And I think we're seeing something similar nowadays.
Perfect, Fabio. Thank you so much. So with that in mind, let's kind of really discuss the local situation in Venezuela for a moment. So Maduro is out, but the Chavista regime is still standing despite the early celebrations for regime change. In fact, Delcy Rodriguez's speech last week sounded very protective of the regime itself, and the military are still a key actor in the country. So, what do you make of this scenario for both local Venezuelan politics and the relationship with neighboring nations and the United States?
Well, interestingly enough, before the attack and the kidnapping of Maduro in Venezuela, there were like a lot of analogies being presented talking about Iraq, right? And the idea that you can change a regime and everything will change magically. And unfortunately, we're observing similar lessons from that process because at the end, in this kind of government or regimes, what we observe is state structures that align the military and the security apparatus to a particular elite. And this alliance is extremely strong and powerful. And because of that, they don't really depend or care about political representation and what the majority of the people wants to do. So in that sense, that makes really difficult to have a transition just because you took Maduro out and you're threatening further military actions. The reality is that the military setup and the military elite that is taking care of Venezuela was set there for 2 decades or more since Chavez was in power, because he supported his politics through the military, because that was the only group that he trusted after the failed coup d'etat that he observed in the early 2000s. And in that sense, having Daisy Rodriguez as a president doesn't really change things that much. It could be seen a little bit as window dressing. They have announced that they will release several prisoners, and the numbers that they're releasing are being contested because people is claiming people are not really being released in the numbers that they promised. So it's hard to know in these games of mirrors what is happening in the ground. But one of the tricky things that Venezuela faces is, despite having an elected president who suffered election rigging, they cannot take hold of power because they don't control the institutions. So it brings a question about democracy as the participation of citizens, and democracy as the consolidation of institutions that can't respect citizens' voices. And the question then, if we want a democratic Venezuela that could bring more development to Venezuela, is how do you present a setting in which institutionally the country enables the participation of its citizens? Currently, it does not. And I doubt the discussion about the threats or the drones or whatever might come later is actually tailored for that purpose. Nothing is being said about democracy. And we must not forget that Venezuela, yes, is the biggest oil reserve in the world, but it also has a lot of rare minerals. And nobody's thinking about that relationship, because one of the arguments that is being said is now the US is going to milk the oil out of Venezuela. But there's no infrastructure for that because the infrastructure collapsed. And this is a game that has more than 2 steps behind that when we need to think. And my reading of the situation, this is more like a geopolitical positioning in terms of access to resources, thinking on China, because if you think about the sanctions with China, once Trump put those sanctions in place, he took them back quite quickly, because China controls 90% of the rare minerals of the world, the production, the harvesting. And having countries like Venezuela and other countries that think about the peace agreement in DRC is enabling the US to diversify the access to mineral resources and gain more leverage so they can compete, discuss, or whatever they want to do with Venezuela. So at the end, I think it's not going to be a great change. I mean, it will take more, and it's similar to the argument of the article in Al Jazeera saying look, the military response can just achieve so much, just you guys, you can put boots on the ground, but that won't bring development. That won't change the landscape. So the question, and this is a really hard question, is how to enable a societal transformation in which Venezuelans can bring their voice and rebuild their country in their own terms. And I don't think these kind of agreements will lead us to that, And for example, the recent Nobel Peace Prize winner went and offered presented libations and salutations to Trump, and she got a tote bag out of that, and no promises of what is going to happen with democracy. And to be honest, this has been always like that. The US has been like that. The thing is that the dissonance between the discourse and the reality is so raw that it's hard to not to see what it is about currently. So where you had Obama that was talking with a greater group, or Trump, the reality is that the US does US, and that's their business. Their business is imperial business, and empire is about resources.
Fabio, let's have this conversation about the US now that you brought this up. So removing an illegitimate ruler, as you mentioned, does not automatically produce stability. And experience tells us that coercion without legitimacy is usually a fast-paced formula for making crisis into scenarios of constant insecurity. The US responds to this situation with very confusing statements. It's law enforcement operations. There are threats against the new leadership. There are talks about running the country. And of course, there's the greater slogan of the Donroe Doctrine. So tell us, really, what are your views and critique of this foreign policy approach to Venezuela? And what are the steps that you think might follow?
Well, this is just basically opportunism at a global scale. So the US is trying to get as much as they can and the best deal that they can get in the great circumstances. Something that we need to consider is that when we see all these declarations, they are tailored for particular audiences, where they're the Cubans in Florida thinking about midterm elections, where they're like people in Iran or Russia, where they're trying to put some geopolitical pressure. All these different messaging like respond to different constituencies, and that doesn't mean necessarily that there's a consistent plan for this. You know, I think like the U.S. government just figured out that they could intervene in Venezuela, and the cost of doing it were relatively low. You know, and the success of the operation, in the terms of like that there were no political costs for the U.S. Having images of U.S. soldiers being dragged or killed in the operation, like makes it really good to sell because it's seamless for the U.S. for the image, for the imagery, for the idea that they can intervene. But at the end, like you could see, like Trump was trying to arrange meetings with CEOs of oil companies to try to see what he could do in terms of like leveraging his influence or his threats to Venezuela into oil production for the U.S. because that would change the relationship with Canada. That sends a lot of like oil to the U.S. So there's the local, there's the regional, there's the international, right? So what the U.S. is trying to get is leverage and resources as much as they can, you know, whatever deal they can get. However, when you think about the oil, the infrastructure is broken. And that doesn't happen from one day to another. And given that the government in place is still a regime, it makes it hard for people to go and invest there, right? And then that brings questions about what is the end game. Of course, that's the end game in relation with Venezuela. But the other end game in relation to what that signals in the region, when you had at some point 25% of the US naval forces in the Caribbean, the threat of that is real. You have like a single aircraft carrier has pretty much more fighter aircraft than the rest of Latin America, excluding Brazil, right? So there is a big threat and a big like a boogeyman that is not just talking, it's doing things that nobody considered possible because it breaks international law, it breaks all the things that we thought they were real and rules and institutions. So it helps them, and I'm talking about the US and the current regime in the US, to try new negotiations. I feel the approach of the US is trying crazy stuff in the light of international law and human rights, and try to see what they can get out of that. You know, so it's like one step at a time. It's completely ironic or that they're doing the same script as in Iraq, and then just trying to figure out how to do it. You know, what to do, when to intervene, who to bring in. But at the end, I think that can create a problem because that if that creates more instability, there will be more migrants for the US looking for shelter. You know, people is not going to the US because they want to become American. They're just trying to like earn a living because there's droughts, there's violence, there's all these things. So I think that in the long term can create a little bit more trouble if he wants to do that. With the wider geopolitical landscape, that signals that Latin America is the US backyard and nobody can get in there. And this is thinking on 10, 15 years ahead, whatever kind of contestation is going to happen between the US and China, because that is in the radar. Europe is not really important for the US. China is the one that they're thinking about. And that's what they're trying to figure out how to prepare about this, right? So I think there will be like pressure on the countries in the region to reduce whatever kind of relation that they have or they were deepening with China. But in that same sense, he's not only using force, he's also like using financial leverage. If you think about the parliamentary elections in Argentina, he threatened Argentinians that they wouldn't get money for a bailout if they didn't vote for Milei's, the current president of Argentina, for his party. And he achieved that. He recently released from prison a drug trafficker that was in prison in the US, former president of Honduras, to mobilize politics to support his political cause. So he's supporting the right in the continent. That, in any other country, that is called meddling, right? And that's clear political interference because that suits them. People that think that aligns politically or ideologically with him are more likely to do business with him, right? And they become a symbiosis between them, in which they provide the natural resources, they stay at an arm's length with China, and the US like keep looking like in a better prospect as they were before.
Okay, Fabio. So we moved from international to regional to local relations, and I can see your point about the reconfiguration and old configuration of these power structures. But let's talk empirically. Many countries in the region, and I would say at least, within your discussion, Mexico and Colombia have been threatened by President Trump, right? And considering in our case, President Gustavo Petro's vocal opposition in international scenario against Trump's policies, and not only just this recent intervention, but also the situation in Israel, Gaza, and other scenarios. And the fact that Colombia is undergoing a very determining electoral year in 2026, what can you state about the U.S. interventionism as a key electoral topic amidst our usual discussions about security, peace, and drug trafficking here in Colombia?
Well, I think like in Colombia and in the region, because we will have like 9 elections in the region in 2026. Some like 7 of them presidential, 2 of them parliamentary or local government. So the influence is going to be felt, and we already feel it, right? So and that's like the threat of like not being able to export, which like most Latin American countries are big exporters to the US, so already like having higher tariffs or like some sort of sanction would bite us, and like that's the economies of the countries. But also like you can see how that is being leveraged to try to support particular candidates, right? And that the expectation is doing that they will be more likely to have access to natural resources and different supply chains. You know, if you think Bolivia, the lithium, if you think Chile, the lithium that had the right coming in, you know, and the copper that is like strategic minerals for doing batteries, which is part of the global economy. But there might be a backfiring of that because for good or for bad, in Latin America, there's a history that people know a little bit about what was the intervention from the US in the past, when the term was used about banana republics. And you can see that, for example, in the case of Ecuador, when they held a referendum last year, around December, and they asked people if they wanted to host military members from the military of the US, and people rejected that, right? So like that, there can be a pushback, and I think that tension is going to happen across different countries, because countries like Mexico that have a liberal history, or like Brazil, are more likely to push back. I think the countries that like seem to be aligning more with the US currently are the countries that historically were more aligned to the southern dictatorships to an extent, right? And they didn't shake that up. So you see Uruguay, you see Paraguay, and all these countries might be like observing something there. And the case of Peru is an interesting case because their economy is doing well, but the political system is totally broken, right? So people don't feel represented. At least in Colombia, there's a lot of contention about the popularity of the current president, President Petro, but there's a big share of the population that voted and respect that president as a government head and what he's doing. Of course, it is polarized like everything else in the world. But that makes it harder for the US to achieve these goals, because at the end that can push people in a different direction. There's people that didn't necessarily voted for Petro, but now in his response to the US, they see in his actions the defense of the sovereignty of the country, right? And that makes it harder for doing like this kind of like army interventions, but a lot of like less than subtle bullying with like blowing up boats in the Caribbean, and these things will take place. But again, the game is a geostrategic game, right? And then like you have to see how, for example, a country like Colombia that has access to the Pacific and the Atlantic, vast natural resources that have been unexplored in the southeast of the country, given the armed conflict that we had and we still have. The US will play that game, right? But also, like, ironically, that behavior of the US is eroding long-standing relations and partnerships that have been having for years. Colombia is a country that historically has been aligned to the right for until this government. But the police forces and the military forces have been like really having like close partnerships with the US. And that is being like creating some tensions within those relations, because when you have your partner that you have been trained in is threatening to invade you, I think it's a hard sell, and that's what we're going to observe. Like some people will observe a little bit more increase of the right in some countries, depending on the context, and in other countries there's going to be a pushback, and that will depend on contextual factors, which is really hard to as a generally for the region. But I think those are the forces that are at play in each country nowadays.
Luis, you need to turn the mic on.
Sorry, my bad. I'm trying to fix internet issues here. My bad. Fabio, we have 10 minutes for 2 final questions, okay? So we can open up the floor to discussions. In your online work, in your last recent pieces on Latin American relations, and particularly what is going on with Venezuela, you mentioned that the alternative to this scenario of severe militarization in the region is, in your words, an investment in justice and tackling institutionalized inequalities that make violence feasible and profitable. And you mentioned this in your answer to the first question. Could you elaborate a little bit more on this proposal, particularly thinking about Venezuela, and how would this reduce rising tensions in the region, just as you described?
Well, there's an interesting case in the case of Venezuela. I think it's like the inequalities and the role of inequalities is quite a stark one, because when you see Venezuela, some people in Caracas live the high life. They're having champagne in the currency setup, right? Whereas you have like something to close 8 million Venezuelans leaving the country in a short period of time, like a modern day exodus, similar to what we observed in Syria when the civil war started. So that created like big disparities on who can afford a living and what was that living about, right? And in a democratic setting, the importance of justice and development are central to dealing with inequalities. Part of the issue of Venezuela is that this setting was not democratic because it was mostly militarized. So that's a different response to how to achieve an equilibrium within government that is not necessarily democratic. And that makes it extremely difficult in Venezuela, because when you see the figures, Venezuela went to having like a post-birth death rates of babies to the numbers of the 1960s. So the life expectancy in Venezuela dropped significantly. So I think the only way to do that is rebuilding not only the political system in the case of Venezuela, but also like building an economic system that actually is helpful for everyone. Because Venezuela was an economy that was based on oil extraction, but didn't really create enough industry to support itself. So when like the few industries that were there started to collapse, there was nothing else, because also the oil industry collapsed. Like Venezuela now exports like something like 900,000 barrels of oil, and they used to do millions in the past. And of course, that's revenue, and that revenue pays the social bill. But and I hate to give you the answer with a question that I don't know the answer to. But I think also Venezuela presents a really difficult puzzle for us to think, because Venezuela invested a lot in social protection, in health and literacy, but we've achieved nothing. And that's a puzzle, because the criminality increased despite having like literacy rates increasing, right? And I think it's because all that money was invested in achieving outcomes, but not in building institutions. And that brings in the institutional lens of how you build institutions that are able of taking a particular task and fulfill it with or without the same number of resources. The way Venezuela did this was like bringing a lot of like Cuban advisors or consultants to help to do that, but the capacity was not built in Venezuela. And another paradox that Venezuela has that is really like a tricky one for those of us thinking about conflict, peace, and development, is that in theory the government was putting a lot of money on social protection, but criminality increased. And that this is related to the tension between the pro-Chavista and the anti-Chavista group. So the government took money away from police forces in different towns, and that made an explosion of violence. Which also like brings the tension that we cannot have development without security. I'm saying here that militarization is not security. The right to feel safe in the streets. The right, if I am a business owner and I sell hot dogs in the streets, nobody's gonna rob my money, right? That is as necessary as development, because both of them feed each other. If you have people that is willing to work and say, I'm going to sell hot dogs Monday to Saturday, and I'm going to pay the school for my kids and go to university, that's how you create that dynamic. But if you start to break it up because the people that get security is people that is aligned with the party, or criminality is increasing, it's really hard to build it. But I think it can be built. The question is how, and that requires leadership from the top and the bottom that are willing to talk to each other. And unfortunately think that's not the case currently in Venezuela.
Thank you, Fabio. I really like that you brought this idea of a security development nexus into the conversation in Venezuela. I think it's an interesting optic. I'm going to ask one final question, and this is probably my methodological, nerdy researcher side, but I think it's important to ask, which is one thing that I've noticed from even my personal online engagement with the topic is how our usually dividing politics, issues of online misinformation, and social polarization are also feeding into the discussions, the analysis, and the feelings about what has happened in Venezuela. Now, this is nothing new, but I feel like it takes a sharp turn due to the emotional elements that often come from people enduring such a long-lasting authoritarian regime, the people that are diaspora, that left the country, and so on and so forth. What are your suggestions for all those researching and working practically around these issues and in and on Venezuela to deal with what we have discussed today in terms of how to engage, how to navigate, and how to address this new polarizing environment that we see with the Venezuelan topics?
Well, I think that's more than methodological. That's like existential. But thanks for that question. I think like the question is how do we engage with this information given the challenge of having conversation with polarization is not part of the equation. And I think unfortunately what we have is an ecosystem that feeds and is nurtured by polarization. So I think like if we want to have conversations and connect at a human level, we have to change the rules of the game. So this cannot happen via Facebook, this cannot happen via Instagram, this cannot happen via X, right? And it needs to be in like grassroots. That's the only way you can build it. And in a way, like what is ironic is between people that supported Maduro and people that opposed Maduro for everything that he did to Venezuela. Both of them care and love their country. So perhaps the subject of discussion shouldn't be the objective of contention, but is the objective of care, right? And the subject of care. So all Venezuelans love their country. Everyone loves their home. You know, so you make that the subject of discussion. Then you can talk about how we work together, and then you put the factors that block the discussion to create something aside, and then you can move forward because then it becomes like a reality show. So are you going for this character or that character or the soccer team? And it's an inescapable way out because at the end that hasn't served and it's not serving society currently. And I would doubt like it will serve in the future because the rules of the game and the algorithm fits on heightened emotional outbursts from the left and the right. This is not something from the right. This is not something from the left. It's everyone, including us. And the thing is like the algorithms know what are our trigger points. So if we want to have a conversation, avoiding someone like saying like, hey, Fabio, you don't like this. You have to like figure out how to have a conversation that doesn't have that influence. And I think like it sounds like really like a obscure, but these conversations have to happen on a one-on-one on settings that can facilitate this, right? Because I honestly think like our ecosystem of communication through social networks is not conducive for dialogue. It's conducive for self-righteousness, unfortunately.
Oh yeah, thank you. You brought me memories from when I was working on Bosnia and Kosovo, and every time I published something, the backlash that came from ethno-religious themes, it seemed to kind of bite me. So it's really interesting to think about the platforms, what you say, where you say, and how you say it, like this constant reflection of what you're doing. So thank you for that. I'm going to summarize just what I consider are your 5 or 6 maybe key concerns, and then maybe pass on to you, Fabio, to see what your final message for the day is. Okay, so the first thing that you mentioned, or your first concern, has to do with this militarization scenario and the militarization of criminality, using your terms, and it uses militarism as an excuse. It requires a political economy approach, and we need to bring in discussions of inequality of natural resources, of social conditions to the mix. Secondly, you're worried about institutions, and institutions in Venezuela, in your terms, seem to be in a co-opted situation, and they limit severely the participation of citizens, and this is a huge obstacle for the social social transition. In your opinion, social transition needs to be developed and done in local terms and respecting local needs. Your third point goes to this idea of a geopolitical restructuring in the region, a reconfiguration of international, regional, and local politics. It seems that there's a new approach to negotiations, a new form of pressures. And what do we do with this idea that we are the backyard of the United States? How do we challenge that kind of perception? In regards to Colombia, Mexico, and neighboring regions, you mentioned the situation of the influence of the United States, the connection between, Donald Trump's politics and various supporting right-wing candidates across the region. And this will be mediated definitely by issues of access to natural resources. But you also mentioned that this could be a backfiring scenario because societies would generally do a pushback against the United States presence. And you mentioned scenarios like Peru or Ecuador. The fifth point I would say is your concern about the rebuilding of the political and economic system amidst the collapse of the oil extraction infrastructure in Venezuela, but also rising criminality, a lack of an institution building process, and the need for serious capacity building in all the areas that you mentioned, like oil, inequality, development, peace, security, military, police, etc. And finally, the situation of polarization and ecosystem that is nurtured constantly by these divisions. We need to change the rules of the game. We need to give more visibility to grassroots work and find a way to change the subject of discussion, particularly in Venezuela, find out those themes that connect Venezuelans rather than divide them. Fabio, what is your final message today for our audience before we move to the Q&A?
Well, I don't think this is the most cheerful conversation for a Friday afternoon going into the weekend. But I think, of course, the world feels disparaging. Of course, it feels broken. Of course, it feels that we're closer to apocalypse. But what is important is to remember that we can have agents in this process. And as actors interested in peace and development, I think we're trying to do something and is keep trying to work for what you think is right. And I think it's important to hold that message and remember that this is just a blip in history. So we'll see in 50 years' time how things unfold. We're just describing the now or the now. But we have to see and remember that history moves in cycles. So there's a cycle in which the pushback is going to bring more human rights and the respect of humanity, like the consensus that we achieved after the Second World War, after losing millions of lives, brought us to a world that was a little bit more decent. And we seem to have forgotten that lesson, and we're repeating again the killing of people in different places. So hopefully we will strive to push our lessons to remember what is humanity about, or what we think is humanity about. And I will close on that.
Thank you, Fabio. On that note, the rollback versus the pushback, I really appreciate that tone. So, dear members of the audience, Mirsad, Svetlusha, everyone, I open the stage for questions, for comments, and interactions with our guest speaker, Dr. Fabio Díaz Pabón.
Well, thank you, both of you. It was quite interesting conversation, and indeed, it is a perspective from South Americans about these conditions. It's a bit pessimistic. What I hinted from your discussion, Dr. Diaz, is that the change is needed, but there's no capacity for change. So this crisis, therefore, it's only going to make things much worse, right? But let's see if there are any questions. Please indicate that you want to ask a question, so you have a chance to ask Dr. Diaz. Go ahead. Who was the one who raised the hand?
Dr. Daniel Barnett is raising his hand.
Daniel, please join us. Please tell us where you're joining us from.
Yeah, hey there, everybody. I'm Daniel. I'm joining from the University of Dundee in Scotland. So, yeah, good to see everybody. And thank you so much for both of you for your talk today. It was really, really fascinating stuff. And I think my question is posing more on a regional level. And I know it was hinted at previously by both Fabio and Luis during the talk. It was more along the lines of, do you think in sort of light of the Trump administration and its sort of continual almost 1940s-esque imperialism, where the idea that sort of land invasions and seizure of countries and territory could be back on the table. Do you think that there is or could be the development of sort of a pan-South American, Central American, maybe not identity, but sort of security coordination in order to confront this? Because I think what you see with the Trump administration now in terms of its aggression to Greenland, especially, it doesn't look like these sort of notions of imperialist conquest are going to subside, unfortunately, anytime soon. So I was wondering, from a regional perspective, do you think that there is any hope that there could be some sort of joint effort in terms of addressing a security guarantee or security apparatus, at least maybe not to match the US, but at least deter them in some form or another? Yeah, thank you so much.
I think like it is more likely that we'll say first a political response, and this is interesting because the language that is being presented upon the world is a language of force. But then we see like different countries presenting a language of diplomacy or a language of politics, right? So in a way, I think that the first response that we will observe from Latin America is a language of politics. And let us remember that there's different levers beyond just military responses. So, I mean, the US still, yes, a lot of Latin America exports things in the US, but if people stop exporting things to the US, the cost of food is going to increase. So there's different levers that people can use for different pressures. And I'm sure different governments are aware of that. So, for example, when you think about the case of Brazil, when they initially tried to put a lot of pressure on Brazil, Brazil quite quickly pushed back because at the end, Brazil is quite important in the supply chain of food and manufacturing for the US. So there's the classical like liberal peace levers that can be used as well. I'm sure like this is making people think about, okay, we need to militarize, let me correct that. We need to figure out how to provide security in the region. But that creates a little bit of a conundrum because the money that is used in protection is not being used in development. Right, so we start to face that trade-off. One possibility would be like some sort of like cooperation. If that will happen, I think we'll have to see if this gets consolidated and in what shape that will take place. I know there's already like a lot of cooperation between police forces in the region, given the experience with drug trafficking and stuff. So perhaps that could bring in like the idea of the military, because to an extent, and this is ironic, but to an extent, historically, the military in Latin America hasn't really engaged with external aggression. So that's kind of like a new thing. Like everyone has their military, but Costa Rica is a prime example. Well, we don't need that, right? So in a way, like I think there's gonna be like a reevaluation of what is the role of the military in countries in light of external threats, real external threats. But also, like I think, like the geopolitical game can lead ways of creating pressure, saying like, okay, we're going to deal more with the EU or some sort of partnership, right? That doesn't necessarily involve Russia or China. Those are, well, China, I would say, because the US seems to be more fond of Russia these days. So I think that would be like quite ways of doing it. But I think on a one-on-one militarily, I think Latin America wouldn't be able to block aggression, but the US will never be able to occupy Latin America. Right? And they learned that in Iraq, they learned that in Afghanistan, and it's because for that you need to have soldiers in the ground. And as big as the US Army is, you cannot occupy all the countries at the same time. You know, so I think that's the limit, but that doesn't take away the possibility that missiles and bombs are going to be used, but that costs money. So everyone faces a limit of what they can do with the resources they have. And the US has a limit. They have been bluffing about it for a long time, but their military capacity is not infinite. The fact that they rehearsed this operation to abduct or kidnap Maduro for 6 months shows you that there's resources and the limits, you know, and there's also like political resources, and we'll have to see what happens ahead of the midterms, because something that I forgot to mention is all of this is playing to local US politics in the midterms. Taking the discussion away from the cost of living crisis, taking the discussion away from what ICE is doing to their own citizens, taking the discussion of the Epstein files. So when they're doing these things, it's not only for the oil. There's always more cards there. You know, like there's a lot of hidden cards that they're playing. And it's important to consider that like other countries have the capacity to do that, right? So I think like that's not an answer necessarily, but I think like there's the possibility of a stronger political alliance between countries that believe in their own sovereignty. That's the other thing. The political is a fractured political alignment that depends on the electoral outcomes. So the countries that are like hard leaning on the right already, like Salvador, I don't think they're gonna do anything, or Argentina, right? But that doesn't mean citizens in Salvador and Argentina are not pushing back. So that's part of the tensions. However, and this is like a liberal paradox question. Would it be okay if countries that believe in democracy support political parties in other countries that believe in democracy? Because that's meddling, right? And that's kind of like a tricky question, because I'd say like, well, we need to have democracy and support people that is fighting for democracy. But at the same time, we're opposed on the idea of an external actor playing in your own politics, right? So, and I think like the countries will figure out the way in which they operate in that sense. But I think like the articulation of not only governments but organizations and communities will help in the protection of livelihoods and life, and the resistance to this aggression, right? That is kind of just like an opening salvo of what comes perhaps in the next years.
I will jump very quickly, and I want to give time for other questions. But Dr. Daniel Barnett, in your idea of pan-South Americanism, you have to kind of bear in mind what Fabio said about local politics and the kind of fragmentation between the right-wing and left-wing governments here in South America in particular, right? So you have Chile with Cast, you have Argentina with Milei. Here we're discussing Petro's politics, and this year is all about whether, there's a domination of leftist politics, of right-wing politics up until August when we have a new president, and the relationship with Venezuela and the role of Brazil. So I think all of this plays very difficultly into this idea of a pan-South Americanism. In fact, our president Gustavo Petro this week mentioned the idea of a revival of Gran Colombia. Gran Colombia was the idea of Simón Bolívar of uniting Venezuela, Colombia, Peru, et cetera, and everybody laughed. Like the feeling in public opinion and media here is, what is this guy talking about, right? Amidst what is going on in Venezuela. So I think the idea of unity, particularly this year, shows that it's really complicated, because we have not only polarization but everybody pushing for either the left or the right. But let me open up for more questions.
Yeah, we have Maria raised a hand shortly. Maria, you want to ask your question?
I didn't have a question. I was more so applauding the fact that he was alluding to how this is a distraction from what's going on here, and I think that's an important point to make.
Thank you. Anybody else? And while we're waiting, okay, there are already questions. Yes, Novakovic, please go ahead, join us, ask your question.
Yeah, I'm sorry, this is my second time joining, so the questions may be not that thoughtful, but I have one question to you, Fabio, because following the what you mentioned, that's not really about the oil. Would you consider the move more or less like a financial looting of Venezuela? Or to be more precise, would you consider what the US currently does and what the Europeans are planning to be more or less forcing of Venezuela to be more privatized under, let's say, legal subordinations of Western capital markets?
Yeah, you're totally right. I think, that was the logo or the slogan of a political campaign in the 1994 in the US, right? When Bill Clinton was elected. Is economic, something else comes. And what the US is going is for economic power, because economic power can be transferred into political and regional influence. So that's kind of like the game, and the thing is, perhaps because with Trump everything is so raw, we can see the dissonance in the discourse, what they're doing and why they are doing it, right? Because it's so weird. All these conversations about Exxon and these things, in the past they have happened, but they happen in different ways. The manners have changed, but the behavior is the same.
Okay, so while we're waiting for the next question, if I may, because you may directed the conversation in a different direction, you mentioned, interventionism, and people indicate like interest-based and all that stuff. You made a comparison with Iraq, and but evidence thus far, and when it comes to president, shows that he's not up for sending the ground troops. In all these interventions that he have done thus far, none of it involved ground troops, involved some sort of limited military operation. But my question is, what is, first of all, I don't see an Iraq comparison, but possible. I see this more as a comparison to Haiti. And I want to ask you, why is this now a big deal? Excuse my French, right? While 2004, President Bush have done the same thing. Also, the president of Haiti was abducted from his house with his wife and sent to Central African Republic. And there was not a big fuss about it. Now, all of a sudden, the similar things happen, and we're all talking about it as if this is the end of international system and all that stuff. And I'm just wondering, is it really the oil? I mean, is this really the only difference? In Venezuela, there's oil. In Haiti, at least, we don't know. Maybe there is, but they didn't find it yet. Is that the difference? And the how you say? And the second question, which kind of you alluded to, which you can perhaps answer very well, considering that you're in South Africa. We don't hear much from South Africa nowadays regarding these questions, so you can tell us what they think. You said that everybody now chooses this language of militarization, war, the shrewd politics. But some countries, like South Africa, for a while has been pushing more of this justice and rules and approach. And so, I preferred that approach because I think it's more useful, and I see more optimism with that approach than this other rhetorics, which usually leads to nowhere because, as you pointed correctly, there is no capacity to answer in that way. So, two questions. One, what is the difference between now and Haiti in 2004 under President Bush, who also did the same thing? And second is, what's the position of South Africa, and how about this, how you say, approach to rules and justice? Should we abandon that? All of a sudden, we should all just give up on that? Or maybe we should now double the efforts to reassert rules and everything else that have made the international system thus far. Thank you. And then after that, we have Mike. Mike, you're going to excuse me because I abuse my power to ask a question, but I see keep that reference to Iraq keep coming. So I said, let me kind of interject.
No, thank you for that. I think the point about Iraq was talking more about the oil, right? So the relationship with oil rather than the way in which it was done. Because if you think about it, when you had Grenada, when you had Panama, when you have Haiti, this is the fourth time it happens. In Latin America, I think what is the difference? And this is kind of like a political economy of information, if we want to call it. There's more Venezuelans in the world as compared to Haitians. And there's also like the global influence of Venezuela during times of Chavismo increased. So it was preeminent. When people was talking about progressive governments of the left, Venezuela always came part of the conversation. So it became part of the imaginary. So part of the reaction perhaps is because Venezuela was symbolically more important. It's not that they're more important than Haiti, but they have bigger numbers of people talking about it because just basically their populations are bigger, right? If something happened with the French Guiana, I doubt the reporting would be as big, right? That's the first element. And the second element is, I think, is just perhaps not only the actions, because of course the president of Guyana was taken to Central African Republic, but George Bush didn't say like, now we're gonna drill, baby, drill, right? So I think like of course that conversation might have happened, and it's likely that something like that happened, right? Because whatever was the geopolitical interest, where it was minerals or the ports or sugar, who knows? But the reality is because it's so raw and overt, I think that this one has become like far greater, right? And I think it's also like the way in which the US has lost the legitimacy to do these things in the way they did in the past. They're doing the same thing. But the veneer of legitimacy is being eroded continuously. So it's harder to do it without people discussing okay, this was about mineral resources, right? This was about like putting pressure on the region. Before, people would take a little bit longer to do this, and I think that's something that is happening in terms of that difference. And can you remind me your second question again, please?
And the second question is, should we give up on these rules and efforts to establish a better world and just all play in the tune of power and militarization?
No, I don't think so, because I mean, we've been here before, and when we had slightly better of years was because collectively as a species we were trying to get something better than what the deal we were getting, right? So I think like that's the nature of political mobilizations and societies, the idea that we feel comfortable and then we take for granted what we were getting and then we fight back for that or for more. And I think it's the nature of societies, like trying to learn from their processes. Unfortunately, we seem to learn really little about history. So we have to kind of like perhaps think a little bit about education and how do we bring an education that like teaches us and reminds us of our past mistakes so we don't fall on them again. Because at the current moment, we're repeating a 1930s moment in the way the politics are happening, the speed at which the discourse are changing, the fact that people is afraid of talking about justice, gender rights, women's rights, community rights, because they're not going to get funding, and the fact that like now, I mean, the Nazis didn't have Facebook, but now the regime that is promoting this hatred politics, they have Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and who else? What? And AI. So I think it's necessary to try to push back, because otherwise, what are we making with our agency as human beings, right? I know it's tiring. I mean, I know it's not the end of the year, but it feels like later,
I know.
right? Because of Trump. But that doesn't mean. I mean, to be fair, we're at the better of side because we can talk about it and we can try to influence these discussions. A lot of people are in the trenches, in the streets, and they're getting a far worse deal than we. So I think like the way we can support them is kind of like raising these issues and talking about these issues and calling things as they are. Fascism, lack of democracy, abuse, lack of human rights. We can disagree perhaps on the terms. We can say like Banana Republic doesn't sound good, whatever, but we need to talk that this is what is happening behind the label, right? And that's important to keep the conversation honest. Mike, sorry.
Yeah, I was just to actually, I think it's important to state that, that we should not be giving up on the rules and justice and all these other things just because, things seems to be difficult at this point. Yeah. But Mike, go ahead.
Yes, there are so many interesting aspects, like in every of these calls, that you don't know which one to ask for. So I'm Mike. I'm dialing in from Munich, a curious citizen, so to say. Coming back to Venezuela and the current situation. So Trump probably wants to get hold of the resources, but probably also predominantly wants to make sure that others do not get hold of it. So keeping Russia and China at bay. So he will probably not give up easily on achieving some goals. Now, what do you think will happen in the next couple of months? So what you see will happen, what will be the moves you expect from the States, the reaction in Venezuela? And as a second part, of the question, what would you recommend the American administration actually to do?
Well, I think like if we want to have an idea what will happen with Venezuela, someone to keep an eye on is a person called Diosdado Cabello. He has control of the security apparatus. If there's a demilitarization of the institutional power of the regime in Venezuela, his power and control of the state can give you an indication if things might shift, right? And that can happen quite quickly, and it's quite unpredictable. However, one of the things of the military apparatus of Venezuela is that, like Maduro and Chavez milk so heavily the military that they were really with him, you know. So whatever regime comes after this will have to provide something that is interesting for them to agree with. You know, lieutenants in Venezuela, as soon as they get the promotion to lieutenants, they get like these super expensive big Toyota cars that are quite expensive.
Yeah.
So that tells you like about the economy of power there, right? And can you remind me your second question again, please? Sorry, I'm forgetting the second question today.
Second, I mean, yeah,
Suggestions.
it's like, what would you recommend? What should they do? What would help? I mean, you can debate it. You can like the Americans, the US guys, yes or no, but they have a power, and they could be positively influential. And you mentioned also the economic despair the countries. I think the gross national product collapsed by 80% over the last decade. So that they could do something. They could do something positive that would actually echo also in the region. So what could that be?
Well, I mean, in the 60s, in the 50s, in the 70s, the US actually, during the contestation with the Cold War, they had this thing called Alliance for Progress. And they supported a lot of initiatives in Latin America that was soft power to build development and fight poverty, because the discussion was between the socialism and capitalism. So they figured out a softer approach was necessary. And this was in the middle of like guerrilla insurgencies in different countries. So I think something like that, like a well-meaning neighbor that, of course, is self-interested, could pay off quite well. But I feel, unfortunately, the current regime just understands the language of force, even if it is just for performative matters. I think like the government and those in power understand these other factors, but they're trapped in these news cycles and this ecosystem of information that works on polarization. So like having like a greatness, as Mandela would say, to make the right choices is something that is quite unlikely to happen openly, and that makes us believe this narrative that we live in a Lord of the Flies kind of universe, right? So that's the paradox. But I feel like well-meaning support, development, like USAID, can go a long way. But that's not what the US is interested in. The state, the government, not their citizens. I think their citizens have a different vision of that. And that's what we'll start to see in the midterms, right? If they can change that, despite of the rule rigging and all this pressure and all these eyes and all these things, that could reconstitute a democracy and political representation that doesn't breed populists. Because the reason why Trump was elected is not because of Trump, it's because people were so angry about the past governments that they chose the craziest option they had. But nobody is reflecting like what the Democrats did wrong for years, that the share of the black vote in the US increased with Trump, right? Or that the Latino vote goes with Trump. I mean, there's something fundamentally that is not being acknowledged by political elites, and is what we're doing wrong. And I think that would be like introspection would be like helpful in that case.
I would add one thing, if you don't mind, to answer Mike's first question, which is a new topic of discussion the last 2 days here in South America and in US media circles, which is the seizure of yet another oil tanker. And this time, this oil tanker was trying to evade kind of protected lines by the US and is trying to evade the usual routes that tankers took between Venezuela and Cuba. So this new tanker situation shows that there were certain groups, economic and political groups, that were drifting and finding ways to evade what the United States has been controlling at the moment. So I think we're going to get more of that, right? So the situation is people are going to try to play the map, the maritime map, the political map in ways, that they can keep their old connections, but avoid the new threats. And this is going to be something that the United States will have to kind of continue monitoring. And that obviously, it comes at a cost and it comes with an effort. And, amidst all this political discussion that Fabio mentions, this will play a lot. Obviously, this is, this in the long term, this will get tiresome, I would say. Svetlusha, you have your hand raised.
Yes, thank you. Hello to everybody. I'm Svetlana Surova. I'm dialing in from countryside of Slovakia, very close to the Slovak military base. So I hope that it will that this connection will stay till the end of my question. Once again, on the behalf of MIRI, big thanks to Dr. Fabio Díaz Pabón and for great presentation, and for Dr. Santander for extraordinary moderation of this seminar. It's very appreciated. Dr. Fabio Díaz, you mentioned how this US intervention in Venezuela breached the international law, and Dr. Santander introduced that you will speak about legality and legitimacy, but I kind of missed your input here. So my question is, what do you think how this intervention, what kind of implications it will have for international relations, but also international law? And Mirsad was kind of asking in a similar vein, but what this event, it is not first time that US broke international law, but what do you think what this will mean, for example, for Ukraine, for Taiwan, other states? And so that is my first question. Second question, it is concerning, you were mentioning everything what needs to be done in country, in Venezuela, but also I missed there the word, you mentioned maybe in some other aspect, democratization, and you did not talk about, when the good guys go and take out the bad guys, it's like kind of okay for everybody, but now everybody, and not in regard to Venezuela, look at the US, like maybe they are now bad guys when they want to take Greenland, not Venezuela, but Greenland, but would the situation be different if the US would kind of use the human rights narrative and democratization, that they would take an undemocratically elected president to support transition to democracy in that country? Because this is not what has happened, but I'm just wondering, would that be different for the people in Venezuela and maybe for the rest of us? And I think that I will stop here because we are taking too much time, but thank you.
Well, thank you for that. I just posted something in the chat related with a piece in which I can elaborate in greater detail what I'm going to say now. But basically, the international order, I always see it like as when you go into a traffic light. How do you react? When you see a car running the red light, you think about it. When you see 2 or 3 cars running the red light, you say like, well, I might run the red light as well, right? And part of the issue of having these behaviors where like actors, and this is not only the US, the aggression towards Ukraine from Russia was an example, that people start to disobey the rules of the road, that just kind of like invites opportunism for different actors, because people say like, okay, this is happening. So UAE goes to Sudan, right? Turkey meddles in Lebanon, Israel meddles in Syria. So it becomes like a way in which the rules of the games are reconfigured around like trying to make the red light for everyone. But the social cost for everyone, for the globe, is worse. Because these decision makers are thinking that they will profit from that, but they're thinking of the profit. They're not thinking of the profit of Venezuelans or other countries, right? That's the first element. The second element is the second about discourse and justification and narratives, that I think is quite important. If Maduro was actually legitimate, would that change the ring of the situation? In that sense, right? Because we know like he rigged elections and he was an autocrat, and part of the justification is like, yeah, he wasn't a good guy, but it's still one bad doesn't justify the other, right? If I was like hit as a kid by someone, that doesn't justify me taking violence onto someone else. So I think like the thing is that this creating a narrative in which that becomes acceptable, But I feel that this narrative is the narrative of a bully, and it's like a narrative of bluffing, right? So the question is like it's similar to when Putin says like I have nuclear missiles, right? And he sends Orishnik missiles to Ukraine, and then like they're like, yes, we forgot Russia has nuclear missiles. So how do we engage with this guy, with the Russian Federation? So I think it enables that, but at the end, delegitimizing discursively and all these actions helps because we cannot create a language in which these things are right. We need to call wrongs what they are. Of course, Maduro was an autocrat. Of course, Maduro rigged the election. That's nobody's gonna deny that. But you cannot come with a discourse where they say like, and US soldiers came to Venezuela and in self-defense. What do you mean self-defense? You kidnap a country, a sovereign country, and kill people there. That's not self-defense. That is called aggression. So we need to call things what they are. And that's part of the discussion that we need to keep pushing back against, because we're pushing that against algorithms that are like trying to that are extremely good, and AI is going to make our task even more difficult. But it's important to call it as it is. Of course, we come into a context in which countries are trying to position themselves for something, to be the biggest guy in the playground. But in the long term, like the biggest guy in the playground can be the biggest bully, but if nobody plays with them, they all change their mind. They all change their manners. We see it in playgrounds, right? And that was what we had achieved with the international order post-45, right? A set of rules that had like a lot of problems and glitches, the Security Council and things like that. But it was an effort to take it, not to bring us to heaven, but try to avert us jumping into hell, as Hammarskjöld once said, right? So it's important to keep bringing that, because yes, it's hard, it's difficult, but the prospect of not doing anything is going to be worse for everyone, right? For US citizens, they're doing better off these days, right? For Venezuelans, we'll see how they do. Hopefully, I'd like that they get a better livelihood, but I think it's quite unlikely when someone else is extracting resources as opposed to building a country. And this is just enabling different actors that think they can have enough guns to do something. Like, luckily, Brazil is a country that understands what a country is, because with their army, they could easily try to do things in the region, but they're not doing it. So there's different ways of proceeding as an international actor, showing a little bit more maturity. And I think that's something that we have to do, call things what they are, right? Not saying like, oh, this was like an operation for taking someone from one place to another. No, it's a kidnapping or an abduction, right? It wasn't an aggression. Like, it was attacked with missiles. Like, people are being killed in the Caribbean without due process. That's assassination. That's summary execution according to international law. So we need to call things what they are. Of course, it makes it hard for us, because the political economy of knowledge is about saying what the power wants us to say, you know? But if a particular country kills people from a particular population, we need to say it. If the Israeli government is killing Palestinian civilians, we have to denounce it. If the US government is killing Venezuelans, we have to denounce it. If the Russian keeps killing Ukrainians, we have to denounce it. Because all of them are wrong. It doesn't matter if I like Israel more than I like Russia, or vice versa. We need to say what is wrong by their name and repeat it. And that's kind of like the way the international order can survive or recast itself, despite the pressure that we're observing these days.
Okay. I will just like to remind you, you didn't you didn't say anything about South Africa, and I said
yes.
You're in South Africa, you will be quite interested, because this is one of the players in international sphere that pushes for these things. So it will be quite interesting. And then also, you know, I appreciate these discussions on so-called third level of politics, as they would say. But I was also very much looking to see, maybe Dr. Santander can tell us, like, what are ordinary people in Colombia? What's the mood of the people? Like, okay, you know, do they kind of go about their lives like nothing ever happened, or there is some sort of I don't know, new thing, or somehow how the ordinary people reacting to this new reality? But let's see that South Africa stuff.
Well, thank you for reminding me that. That's why I need people to ask people what was the second question. I get carried away. And also, like, I didn't have notes on it. But I think, like, the case of South Africa is an interesting one because post-94, South Africa was quite strong and deliberate trying to support peace missions in different countries in Africa, right? In a way, like, Mandela not only became a symbol, but became an actor that tried to support different negotiations, DRC and other countries in the region, right? However, the military in South Africa restructured itself for the nature of the transition of the South African reality that was like an autocratic, authoritarian regime in which military forces were used to oppress their own people. You know, what is happening with ICE in the US to an extent, you know, like it was used to police South Africa. So that explains part of the transformation. But that doesn't mean South Africa stopped trying to project strategic force or influence. Not attacking, right? But like South Africa has a fleet of fighter jets that are like the Swedish Gripen, and they have a fleet of naval ships that like they have. You know, they don't use it. But I think like that idea of strategic deterrence was still part of the way of seeing things. And currently, close to where I am, there's like, thank you for the link, Espelusa. There's like naval exercises in Simonstown with Iranian, Indian, Chinese, Brazilian, and Russian vessels, right? As part of the BRICS. So that is still happening. Of course, I don't think like South Africa is doing that thinking of they're going to attack another country. But I think also like there's the appreciation of the limits of what that can do and how feasible it is, right? So I think it's more like showing like, okay, we're prepared to respond to you. It's like what is happening with Greenland when France sends 13 soldiers and Norway sends 12 soldiers and France sends 10 soldiers. Like the signal is there, right? But it's the message is more political than, and the implications are more political than forceful, right? But I think like a lot of countries are reconsidering what to do about their militaries nowadays. Europe clearly changed the discourse from that was unnecessary to we need to get to 5% of the GDP, you know, and school grants are being transformed for bullet and shells for cannons in the future for some prospects of confrontation. So I think that the realities can change the ideas dramatically and quite quickly. And the one about the mood, I think like Luis and I can respond to that. I would say briefly, it depends who you ask. Because it's a polarized society. So people that like are supporting Petro, they're gonna say he's doing great. People that love their country being independent, they say it's great. But a lot of people love the US as an idea of what Colombia could become. And for them, that's okay. They took out Maduro. They did what they needed to do. So what? So I think like that makes it really tricky in terms of that. But that's going to be part of the next presidential election, and that became central, right? But what is interesting is that the current president recently stated that whenever Trump attacks him, his popularity increases. Petro is not the most popular president of the world, I have to say that. But 37% of Colombians support him, and his support base is quite devoted to him, right?
Loyal, yeah.
Yeah, so he's increasing his popularity, and recently his popularity rankings are going up because he's saying like this is an independent country. So like you know, it's 37, it's 1/3, it's not even half full, half empty. But that shows that like the difficulty of talking about the mood of a whole nation. You know, that also applies to South Africa, because people in South Africa were supportive of the Venezuelan government because of the idea of a left-wing country moving progressive agendas, the idea of it, not the praxis of Venezuela. But a lot of people, some people would say the opposite here, right? So I think like the idea of an average citizen or an average South African Colombian is quite tricky because it doesn't exist, unfortunately, or maybe luckily because that's democracy, right? So I think that's a tricky one. I know it's not that as clear cut as you would prefer, but the government is behind supporting Venezuela. But the population, I mean, the unemployment in South Africa is 50%. So in the ranking of priorities, Venezuela goes way below finding food for the next meal, right? So I think it depends on where you stand. I mean, And I think like that doesn't mean that people is less human. It's just like we just have a limited capacity to think about the interest of others when I'm hungry, when I'm starving, when I'm facing cold, when, you know. So I think that makes it tricky. And I think in closing, I think like societies that are less vulnerable, and that relates a little bit with the paper, are more likely to see and think of your own humanity and others' humanities. When everyone is please forgive my language, in a rat race, it's hard to expect that we can reflect about each other. We can talk about these issues because we have the space to engage about the well-being and the conditions of other countries. If we were not in a position to think about it, we wouldn't even register it. So I think like development opens a gateway for humanity in that sense. How the question is how to do it when the economy, the discourse, and society seems to be going in the other direction, right? Yeah. Friday afternoon talks.
Doctor, what about you? How things are? What's the mood?
Yeah, I was going to go to that. So the best way to answer that would be to focus on 3 different populations or 3 different scenarios. And the first one has to do with what we've been talking with Fabio during the conversation, which is elections year in Colombia, right? So we have 2 very important candidates right now. One is called Abelardo de las Priella. He is a right-wing candidate. And Iván Cepeda, who is the left-wing candidate and kind of, you know, the legacy of Gustavo Petro. And if you look at their stance and how people back them up, you can really tell about, you know, the feelings about Venezuela and the concerns. So Abelardo de las Priella was very happy with what happened in the United States, and he was calling at some point for a U.S. invasion of Colombia. He was saying, oh, it would be great if this would happen here because we would finally get rid of Gustavo Petro, who is a drug trafficker, who is in the Clinton list. Let's not forget about that little detail. And, you know, who is selling the country to drug traffickers. So that's one side of the discourse. And the more loyal members of Centro Democrático, which is the right-wing party here in Colombia, were like, yes, we want this sort of intervention. We need that. Once we have that, Colombia would be back into normality using their political speech. Versus people like Iván Cepeda, who in the same line of Petro, was denouncing what happened in Venezuela as U.S. imperialism, as another form of intervention. And of course, as Fabio said, the loyal followers of Petro and now loyal followers of Iván Cepeda were kind of denouncing, contesting all of this. Actually, yesterday here in Bogota, they closed one of the key avenues that goes to the airport because it's the avenue where the U.S. embassy is located, and a lot of people went there, burned flags, and they, you know, did this protest against what the United States is doing in the region. So the polarization of our politics is now jumping into this, and of course, the right wing and its followers would love this discourse of, oh, let's go back to business, entrepreneurship, sponsored by the US. We need more US investment, so let's bring them back here. Whether an intervention or not, military or not, we need them on our side. We've always been irrestrictively aligned in our foreign policy to the US interest, so let's bring that back. Versus, you know, the Petro followers and the leftists who are saying, we've started a new era, we've started a new discussion. Look at, you know, how Petro has taken international spaces, international roles, and talked about these very important things, and we need to keep doing this, right? So that is one of the tests of our election. But the third population that I would like to focus on are the people that are living in the border with Venezuela, right? That, I think that's another issue that we need to discuss. The Catatumbo region, and I think Fabio knows more about this because that's his home or close to his home, is at the worst in terms of our political violence. It's, you know, overtaken by ELN. We're having terrorist attacks. We're having, you know, all the usual political violence that Colombia's had in increasingly high levels there, as well as a couple of regions. And people there are really concerned about the opportunity that has been brought because of the instability of Venezuela, of ELN, of El Tren de Aragua, of El Clan del Golfo, all these organizations that are making the most out of chaos and anarchy, as it usually happens. So if the border doesn't get protected, if people are flowing from one side to the other, either for moving drugs or bringing immigrants from one side to the other, this adds up to this tension. And those are the people that are kind of demanding a quick response to a critical emergency, a humanitarian, a security, a human rights emergency in the border. The response of Gustavo Petro has been to put military in the area, but alternatively, he has continued to fail in his total peace policy to negotiate with the actors that are moving drugs from one side to the other. So I think that's the other side of this discussion. You know, the armed conflict in Colombia feeds into these discussions because the United States is another actor that influences what happens here in terms of peace and security.
Amazing. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Santander. So we are now approaching the time when we have to finish, but it was very refreshing to hear this perspective. Honestly, I was a bit surprised. Dr. Diaz, excellent, approach, totally unexpected. I invite all of our followers to read the work of Dr. Diaz and also the work of Dr. Santander. They are genuine scholars who are looking basically at things from multiple directions. I always appreciate that bottom-up direction, and I hope that Svetlusha, that MIRI will also link their articles and their work so that people can read it. And I hope we reconnect again and find out what actually really happened. We speculated now this time a lot, but we are going to see what happens very soon with these midterm elections coming here in the United States and all these the new developments that happen in and around Greenland, right? And so thank you again for being with us today, everybody, and hopefully we'll see you again next month. We're going to move on to next topic, and we will continue engagement with both Dr. Diaz and Dr. Santander. Thank you.
On my behalf, thank you to everyone who attended, particularly Daniel, Ayrton, Mike, Svetlusha, everyone who asked their questions. It helped really bring out Fabio's insight a whole lot more beyond the presentation. So thank you for that. And Fabio, thank you for an excellent interaction with the audience and excellent presentation.
Thank you to you guys.